This morning, our gospel lesson comes to us from the Gospel according to John, continuing on in chapter 6, and a perfect Sunday for that to come as it talks about the bread of life, and this morning we will share in communion with one another. We pick up at verse 25 as the crowds are still trying to follow and find Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "I tell you the truth. You are looking for me, not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him God the Father has placed his seal of approval." Then they asked him, "What must we do to do the works God requires?" Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." It's as simple as that. Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." So they asked him, "What miraculous sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Our forefathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, 'He gave them bread from heaven to eat.'" Jesus said to them, "I tell you the truth. It is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to this world." "Sir," they said, "from now on give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Those who come to me will never go hungry, and those who believe in me will never be thirsty." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
A loaf of bread. A loaf of bread. Something that seems simple to us, something that we run down to the grocery store and we put in our cart and we check out, something easy for us to come by. And because it's so easy, I think that a loaf of bread, the symbol of bread sometimes, is lost on us as a powerful example of what Jesus is trying to teach. Because we're not like those refugees in Syria who are fleeing ISIS, who are going into camps and have nothing to eat. To them, bread is precious. We are not like those children that live maybe 10 miles from us in downtown Anaheim who grow up moving from motel to motel, who don't have food in a refrigerator over the weekend. We're not like those children that need to receive a backpack from Giving Children Hope each Friday that is filled with food for their family to sustain their life. And so sometimes the image of bread as life is lost on us. Because we can just pop down to Vaughn's or even across the street to Big Lots. We can go over to Subway and just ask for a roll. Bread is abundant here. It's not like it was even in Jesus' time. And there's an ironic nature to bread. The very process that makes it bread, that helps it to ferment and rise, is also the very process that causes it to spoil, and sometimes spoil quickly. Jesus refers to, and the people, the crowds refer to the manna that God provided in the desert with Moses. But what we know about that manna is that you could only collect it for one day because it would spoil so quickly. Only enough for one day. When I was junior high age, I got to spend part of a summer in Colorado with one of my cousins. She had a horse ranch out in Evergreen, Colorado. And she also used to make her own breads and stuff, and she had a sourdough starter. And I don't know if any of you have seen sourdough starters. You probably have. And many of them are passed down from like generation to generation. But sourdough starters are tricky. You have to feed them and care for them properly so that they don't rot, so that they don't go awry, so they don't become unbalanced. You have to work with them. So bread is this kind of ironic symbol of something that brings life and yet can spoil easily. And these crowds that are following Jesus are wondering about him. I am the bread of life. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And the crowds are like scratching their heads because they can't figure out what Jesus is talking about, because they're talking about the here and now. But Jesus is talking about a much broader vision, a much longer future. But these crowds are relentless with Jesus. They keep trying to find him. And Jesus must be thinking, if you give a mouse a cookie. Because here come these crowds, and they're following him because they still want him to be king. They want him to be that political figure, that political prophet that is going to save them from the here and now. And when Jesus kind of disappears for a while, when he took that little excursion walking on the water and he gets over to Capernaum, the crowds look at the shoreline where he was and they count the boats, and the math doesn't figure. They cannot figure out how Jesus got from one place to the other, so they assume, oh, he must have found a new road, a new path, which is important to their thinking. When they're thinking about Jesus being king, they are thinking about their own viability. The Romans had built roads so that the soldiers could easily get from point A to point B. They built those roads so the soldiers can go from province to province, town to town, and keep order. So now the crowds are thinking, Jesus has made a new road. Because we didn't see him in the boats. We don't understand why the boats don't work, so there has to be a new road. And they're also thinking, and we could be Jesus' army. We want Jesus to be king, and we're going to be Jesus' soldiers, because the Roman soldiers were paid a fair wage, one that allowed them to support their families. So they're thinking, Jesus is going to be king. He's made some new roads so we can maintain order, and we're going to be paid a fair wage so we can support our families. That is the length of their vision of Jesus. But Jesus has a much broader vision, a much long-term vision. But the crowds come to them and they say, how can we work for this bread? And when they say bread, they mean daily bread. Where do we sign up to be part of your army so that we can receive this fair wage? But Jesus is not talking about temporary nourishment. He already showed the crowds when he fed the 5,000 what can be done in community. He already showed them that if they come together as a community, there is more than enough for all of them, plus there's leftovers. There's 12 baskets of leftovers that they can share with others. Jesus reminds the crowds that the things of this life have a shelf life. The food that we have now will spoil eventually. How many of us have cleaned out our pantries or our refrigerators, You find the little biology experiment in the back, okay? You're going through the canned goods that got stuffed to the back and you realize they expired 2 years ago. I've done that and I feel bad because at least I could have donated that someplace. At least I could have given it someplace, but we have so much that sometimes our abundance gets shoved to the back and then it spoils and then it can't be used. So Jesus wants us to bring that forward before it spoils so it can be used. Everything has a shelf life, except for maybe Twinkies. But I'm pretty sure everything else does. Jesus wants to give those crowds something more sustaining than a single meal with a doggy bag. Jesus wants to give them the thing that is going to feed them spiritually. He wants to give them that thing that's going to fill that God-shaped hole that they have in their souls and in their lives. He wants to give them the thing that's going to give them continuous nourishment. So he offers himself as the bread of life. Not just bread for our bodies, but bread forever. He offers to the crowds, and we are those crowds. He offers to us a relationship to God through himself. Jesus wants us to have that continuous and sustaining and life-giving relationship that helps our faith be instinctive and reflexive and intuitive. So several weeks ago, you guys know that I was rear-ended in my Suburban, and it ended up totaling my Suburban. I was super sad about having to get rid of it. I got a little attached. I admit that's my sin that I have to keep praying about. So I was able, though, to purchase an Acadia. I'm kind of a GM girl, I admit that. Butch likes that. Yes. Because I did a lot of research, but I got a new Acadia, and that was great. But I still want, my gear shift now is down here, but in the Suburban it's up here. And so I get in the car and reflexively I go like this to get out of park, but that's not, and my parking brake on the Suburban was a hand thing, and now it's a foot thing, and oh my gosh, all my instincts are wrong for this car until I drive it enough. When we are in a vehicle that we've had for a while, we reflexively, we instinctively know where everything is. And we know how to operate. Jesus wants us to have such a deep and abiding relationship with him that our faith becomes reflexive, that our faith becomes instinctive. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to think about how we're going to respond to somebody in distress. We don't have to think about how we're going to pray for somebody who needs it. We just know that we're going to do that our relationship has made us instinctive Christians. We are part of those crowds that have that deep hunger for Christ, a deep hunger for a relationship with Christ so that our lives will be transformed. Several years ago, I think they started these commercials during the Super Bowl commercial thing, but there were some commercials with portraying some kind of grumpy people in difficult situations, and they were portrayed by actors like Betty White and Abe Vigoda. They were playing football players, and they were out on the field, and there's one with Robin Williams as a coach, and there's one with Godzilla as these grumpy people. And then one of the concerned people with them gives them a Snickers. You guys have seen this commercial? And it transforms them back into who they were. And, they're like, and they say to them, "You're not who you are when you're hungry. You're not who you are when you're hungry. We're not our best selves when we're hungry for Christ, hungry for that relationship." We are not who God intended us to be without that bread of life, without partaking in this table with each other. The thing that gives us the sustenance for each week is our continued worship together, our daily prayers and devotions. However it is that we relate to one another and relate to God, that is the thing that fills up that hole. This is the bread of life that helps us with that spiritual hunger so we can be exactly who God wants us to be. Jesus Christ is offering to us always the bread of life. So what is this bread of life? It's freedom from the distress of life. It's sustenance in the wilderness of life. It's grace in the pain of life. It's God's presence in the loneliness of life. What is this bread of life? It is rest in the midst of the demands of life. It is peace when life gets disrupted, and it's community in the isolation of life. So this day, we are invited all to come to this table and take in the true bread of life. Amen.